Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy, where we bring you the stories behind the health headlines.
This podcast is brought to you by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Body Cream. 800-345-7339, on the web at uttercream.com. Psilocybin is a hallucinogenic compound from mushrooms. Does it have any potential for helping to treat psychological distress? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Today, we're talking with a psychiatrist who treats patients with life-threatening cancer. Sometimes their diagnoses are so demoralizing that they lose sight of the meaning of their lives. Could their depression and existential anxiety be eased with psilocybin?
Dr. Jeffrey Guss, a psychiatrist at New York University, was one of a group of investigators that conducted a controlled trial of psilocybin for just such patients. The results of their study were remarkable.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, you'll learn about the surprising results of the psilocybin and cancer anxiety study.
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy health headlines, indulging in a sardine sandwich or tuna salad for lunch might be a way to keep your joints from complaining if you have rheumatoid arthritis. In a recent study, people with rheumatoid arthritis who ate fish at least twice a week had lower levels of inflammation than those who ate it less than once a month. The lead researcher told the New York Times that the magnitude of the effect is large, about one-third of the expected magnitude of the standard drug treatment of rheumatoid arthritis with methotrexate. Each additional serving of fish added significant anti-inflammatory benefit. While the scientists don't claim a cause and effect relationship, they conclude, our findings suggest that a higher intake of fish may be associated with lower disease activity in RA patients.
Scientists have been debating the risks of hair dye for decades. Some studies have linked hair products to breast cancer, while others have not. New epidemiological research published in the journal Carcinogenesis suggests that there may indeed be a relationship between dark brown or black hair dye and breast cancer among both African American and white women. Over 4,000 women participated in the study. They ranged in age from 20 to 75 and were part of the Women's Circle of Health study. Investigators collected a wide range of data, including physical activity, smoking history, exposure to hormones, alcohol use, and reproductive history. Use of hair products, such as permanent hair dyes, relaxers or straighteners, and deep conditioning creams, was also included in the analysis. Dual use of relaxers and dark hair dyes was associated with more than a twofold increased risk of breast cancer in white women. The risk was most apparent among women who used hair dye frequently and relied upon darker colors. Epidemiological studies like this can never prove cause and effect, but the authors conclude that their data support a relationship between the use of hair dye and some types of relaxers and breast cancer.
Lower back pain is common and debilitating. It's frequently treated with medications, but the American College of Physicians has issued guidelines emphasizing non-drug approaches for acute lower back pain. A new study in the Annals of Internal Medicine compares specially designed yoga classes to individual physical therapy or books and newsletters about back pain. After 12 weeks, the people who had participated in yoga classes or physical therapy reported comparable relief. They also used less pain medicine than those who received educational materials. Overall, however, the differences among the three groups were not dramatic.
Do carbohydrates with a high glycemic index contribute to the risk of developing type 2 diabetes? This hypothesis has been suggested. German researchers analyzed data from adolescents and found that high glycemic index breakfasts did not seem to have an influence on the risk as they matured into young adults. A habit of eating refined carbs in the evening, however, reduced their insulin sensitivity in adulthood. They recommend avoiding high glycemic index carbohydrates in the evening to help prevent type 2 diabetes.
Older people who have dogs get more exercise than those without canine companionship. A British study of people between 65 and 81 years old used monitors to compare physical activity between 43 people with dogs and 43 without. The scientists were careful to match the two groups with regard to gender, weight, height, walking ability, and overall health. On average, the dog owners walked 21 minutes more a day, and they were stepping along at a decent clip. This gets them very close to the World Health Organization recommendations of 150 minutes a week of moderate to vigorous exercise. The investigators conclude that walking the dog is good for both pet and person. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. More than 200 different mushroom species make the compound psilocybin. This natural psychedelic chemical can induce hallucinations. Native people in Mesoamerica used it in religious ceremonies long before the Spanish conquest. In the late 20th century, psilocybin gained popularity as a recreational drug. That pretty much shut down any serious scientific research on this substance. Recently, however, several respected psychiatrists have been looking at its potential for medicinal use.
To learn more about this intriguing compound, we turn to Dr. Jeffrey Guss so he can tell us about his research with psilocybin. He's a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at New York University School of Medicine and is a senior faculty member of the Division of Alcohol and Drug Abuse in NYU's Department of Psychiatry. He's the director of psychedelic psychotherapy training for the NYU Psilocybin and Cancer Anxiety Study.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Jeffrey Guss.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Dr. Guss, you and your colleagues at New York University have conducted some fascinating research. Can you tell us, number one, what prompted this, and number two, what you did and what you found?
I'd be delighted to. This research came together when Steve Ross, Tony Bossis, and I met each other and started a psychedelic reading group. I had attended Albert Hofmann's 100th birthday party, which was a large psychedelics conference in Basel, Switzerland, in, I think, 2005.
Now, Dr. Hofmann was the inventor of LSD, is that right, for Hofmann-La Roche?
That's right. He synthesized LSD when he was trying to actually create some medicines to help with vasoconstriction due to excessive uterine bleeding. And he accidentally got just the tiniest amount of this on his fingers and had the very first psychedelic journey. But I wasn't invited to his private birthday party. It was a large psychedelics conference that I attended that was in honor of his 100th birthday. And it was at that conference that I met Charles Grobe, who was doing psychedelic research with psilocybin, working with people with terminal cancer. And I learned about that and discovered at that point that it was possible for psychedelics to re-enter the academic workplace. I had been interested in psychedelics personally since I was in high school. I was 15 years old during the Summer of Love, and we subscribed to Look magazine and Life magazine. And even at that time, when I read about LSD on college campuses and what LSD did to people, I was fascinated by it and interested in becoming involved in that world. But unfortunately, those medicines left the scene before I really was old enough to actually come on the scene. So it wasn't until the 2000s that this intersection between psychedelic research and my career as a psychiatrist began to come together. So we had initially started as a reading group because, as you may know, there's famously 1,000 articles that were published of human research with LSD and other psychedelics in the 50s and 60s. And so we thought, Tony, Steve, and I, that it might be a good idea to read some of these articles. And, of course, they had methodology that would be considered almost laughable today and would hardly qualify as valid research or research that generated, usable data. But nonetheless, they were working with patients and were finding some remarkable results. It wasn't long, though, after starting the reading group that Tony Bossis suggested that we switch to a research group because he had been interested in giving psilocybin to people with terminal cancer all through his career. And with that, we shifted from reading to research, and that's how our project got started.
Now, would you tell us, please, what you did in the study that was published recently, how you did it, and what you found?
We worked with people who had a life-threatening cancer diagnosis. I do want to note that we did not work only with people who were terminally ill. We worked with anybody who had had cancer and experienced an existential distress or existential crisis in reaction to the diagnosis of having cancer or in response to the treatment that was involved with having cancer. And by existential crisis, I mean, in addition to the anxiety and depression that can come along, a collapse in the sense of life having meaning. And when life loses its meaning, it's a terrible, terrible disaster because everything is colored by that emptiness and that shock and the sense of purposelessness. And what you often see are people who are ready to die, who want to die early, have a desire for a hastened death, or who are, in a sense, living but not really living. They lost their identity as human beings and have become only cancer patients with tumor markers and chemotherapy appointments.
Dr. Gus, how common is that problem among cancer patients?
Well, it's a great question. It ranges anywhere from 30 to 50% in the Western settings. There are some things that are predictors for existential crisis and others that are protective against it. And what you see again and again in studies is that somebody having a strong spiritual foundation protects against an existential crisis. A person can get a cancer diagnosis, can be upset, can be frightened, can be shocked, but may not have this existential sense of meaninglessness and despair if they have a strong spiritual presence in their life. And that is just what we were hoping a psilocybin-based therapy could help them with, could help them either regain or discover for the first time a sense of spiritual awakening and a sense of spiritual belonging and meaning in life. And that would protect against the most terrifying and devastating consequences of the diagnosis.
What did you find?
We found that there was a remarkable response both in the short term and in the long term in participants after their psilocybin session. In our study, there were 2 dosing sessions. One was active psilocybin, and the other was a placebo. Everybody in the study received both conditions, and they either received the placebo first and the active drug second, or the active drug first and the placebo second. And these 2 sessions were separated by 7 weeks. There were 3 preparatory psychotherapy sessions, 3 psychotherapy sessions in between dosing session 1 and session 2, and then 3 afterwards. So there were a total of 9 therapy sessions and 2 dosing sessions. And in a consistent way, after the active drug, depression improved, anxiety improved, the sense of meaning and purpose in life improved, a sense of affiliation and belonging again to the world of the living, and caring more about other people, returned. We call this pro-social or altruistic effects. So people became closed in, turned in on themselves, and pessimistic as a result of their cancer diagnosis. And upon receiving the psilocybin-assisted therapy session, they improved, cared more about themselves, their own lives, but also other people, and felt a sense of meaning and purpose. The other remarkable finding is that the fear of recurrence and the fear of death lessened. We didn't really study whether people lived longer as a result of being in this study, but what we heard consistently from them is that they feared recurrence less, and they feared dying less. So in a sense, the time that they had was more full of life, love, hope, and care about the self and about the world around you. And so we found this to be a really, really interesting and gratifying experience to help people, in a sense, come back to life after a cancer diagnosis and this collapse into existential anxiety.
These are very interesting results. Dr. Gus, did you have a way of integrating the psilocybin experience into people's treatment?
Well, in a sense, that was all that we did. We prepared them for the psilocybin experience, then we monitored and guided them through it, and then we did integration work afterwards with them. And the whole purpose of the integration work afterwards is to take the lessons, to take the experiences that they had while they were under the influence of psilocybin and bring this into everyday life in the non-intoxicated, sober state. For example, a person may feel a deep sense of connection to family, to loved ones, or to hobbies or causes that had a lot of meaning for them. And while under the influence would feel the urge and the impulse to reconnect and to reanimate those interests or those relationships. And so during integration therapy, you would help the person bring that into real life and make that really happen. Because it isn't enough just to have a spiritual experience. You also have to bring that experience into your day-to-day life. Anybody who's ever meditated will know that the lessons that you learn on the stool or on the cushion while you're meditating need to be carried over into the practicalities of life. Otherwise, you're leading a life that's split, and your religious spiritual life is separate from what you're actually doing. And any person who's done spiritual work will tell you that it's applying spiritual practices in everyday life that really transform your life. And that's what we saw again and again. It didn't happen in a completely robust way for every single person that went through the study, but every person just about improved somewhat on their anxiety and depression ratings, and some of them remarkably, and many of them for up to 8 months, which was when we stopped our assessment. So the effects may last longer than 8 months, but our study showed that these remarkable improvements, primarily in anxiety and depression, lasted up to 8 months following the active drug dosing session.
You're listening to Dr. Jeffrey Gus, Clinical Associate Professor of Psychiatry at New York University School of Medicine. He's a senior faculty member of the Division of Alcohol and Drug Abuse in NYU's Department of Psychiatry. Dr. Gus is the Director of Psychedelic Psychotherapy Training for the NYU Psilocybin and Cancer Anxiety Study. His article was published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology in December of 2016. You'll find a link to it from our website.
We also have links to a couple of new articles, Terry, that just have shown up in the medical literature. One is Potential Therapeutic Effects of Psilocybin. That's in Neurotherapeutics. And there's an article, Therapeutic Applications of Classic Hallucinogens. And they talk about where we stand in the newest research on these kinds of drugs. Well, after the break, we'll learn about any side effects or complications of psilocybin that showed up in the study.
How are SSRI antidepressants and benzodiazepine anti-anxiety drugs different in effect from psilocybin?
We'll also find out about Dr. Gus's vision for the future of research on the use of psychedelic compounds.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you like this podcast of The People's Pharmacy and want to continue the conversation, you can join us online at facebook.com/People's Pharmacy to share your thoughts or comments. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Redex Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. The number is 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
If you'd like to purchase a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1084. That number again, 800-732-2334. 2334, or visit our website. It's peoplespharmacy.com. You can also download the podcast from iTunes.
Today, we're talking about how psilocybin could be used for cancer patients who are distraught and anxious about their condition. Our guest is Dr. Jeffrey Guss, Director of Psychedelic Psychotherapy Training for the NYU Psilocybin and Cancer Anxiety Study. He's a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at New York University School of Medicine and a senior faculty member of the Division of Alcohol and Drug Abuse in the university's Department of Psychiatry.
Dr. Guss, everybody wants to know about side effects. There's a lot of fear around psychedelic drugs, LSD, psilocybin, some of the other medications that have been used over the last several decades. Did your subjects have any complications?
They had several predictable and non-serious complications. For almost all of them, there was an elevation in blood pressure and pulse that followed a predictable time course, and that never reached a level where we needed to medicate them with an antihypertensive drug in order to keep their blood pressure, out of a dangerous range. But that's a predictable and common side effect to psilocybin treatment. The other side effect or effect was significant anxiety. Most of the subjects in the study had short periods of significant anxiety, and some of them were quite anxious throughout their entire psychedelic journey, their entire psilocybin experience. But interestingly, that did not correlate with their finding the experience to be worthless or not of value or even negative for them. Again and again, we saw that even the experience of anxiety did not perturb the spiritual awakening that we saw in so many patients. This is common in psychedelic journeys, that there are periods of anxiety, and for several people, not the majority of them, but for several, there were transient episodes of paranoia where they began to feel, I wonder if they're trying to play with my mind, or I wonder, if this is all a big plot to take over my mind. But those were only lasted a couple of minutes and responded to reassurance. These are very powerful agents that bring about marked alterations in perception. And there has to be somebody present, or it's best if there's somebody present, to keep anything dangerous from happening, from somebody getting up and going and doing something impulsive or acting on any of the thoughts that they're having. These are very safe medicines in terms of what they do to the body. Again, there's this elevation in blood pressure and pulse, but they do no harm to the brain and are not difficult for any part of the body, in contrast to, say, alcohol, which has toxic effects on almost all parts of the body. And the more you drink, the more damage the alcohol can cause. So psilocybin is quite a safe medicine from a physiological point of view. It's very powerful and can bring about alterations in perception and distortions and false beliefs. So it's maintaining safety during this journey and making certain that the person does no harm to himself or others. That's so important. So we had no bad incidents of anybody trying to do anything in our study. We were afraid that people would try to jump out the window, which is what you hear about over and over again. But the truth is that all the people in our study, not only did nobody want to jump out the window, but they didn't want to leave at the end of the day. When the study was over, there was such a lovely feeling of warmth and coziness among the therapists and the participant that going back out into the day-to-day world felt like a little bit jarring.
Dr. Guss, how quickly does that psilocybin experience go to work, as it were? How quickly does it take effect?
Well, the response is relatively immediate. People experience an alteration within the same day or the next day in terms of their worldview. During the evening after the dosing day and the next day, there's still a carryover effect where there's still a slight quality of still being intoxicated, which is a slightly floating, magical, kind of twinkling, pleasurable lightness of being that many patients or participants would describe. And then the effects either were sustained or they started to fade. For most people for whom they were sustained, they were ready to make changes in their life and ready to let these altered perceptions and beliefs and thoughts take shape in a different way of living.
Dr. Gus, as a psychiatrist, I suspect that you are very much aware of the available tools that your colleagues have for cancer patients who are going through these kinds of existential crises. Anti-anxiety agents like benzodiazepines, antidepressant medications like SSRIs, Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, and so many others. In your assessment, how much better or different is the psilocybin experience compared to traditional tools in the psychiatrist tool chest?
Well, I have an opinion that psychedelic medicines and psilocybin in particular are in another category and, in a sense, in another realm of medication interventions, and that they are profoundly different. Here's my reasoning. When we look at, say, an SRI, our model for that is that the brain is broken or the brain is dysregulated or there's some imbalance in neurotransmitters, and when you give this medication over a period of 2 to 4 weeks, the balance shifts. The imbalance is corrected or a new balance is reached. The postsynaptic receptors upregulate or downregulate. And so we're looking at basically a biochemical, biomedical model of neurotransmitters being altered, and this resulting in an altered state of consciousness for the patient. The patient doesn't need to do anything or believe anything or really do any particular work whatsoever except taking the pill in their mouth and swallowing it and letting it go to their brain and do its work. Our working hypothesis for how psychedelics work is quite different. These medicines bring about an experience, and it is the altered experience that brings about the changes. And I don't mean that there isn't a biological basis for it, because there is a profound biological basis for the experience that they have. But it's the alteration in life meaning that brings about the changes that follow afterwards. For example, a person might take psilocybin and go to a dance party and, say, a rave, and they might not have a spiritual experience transforming their lives in any way similar to what people experienced in our cancer study. They might have fun. They might have a very close tribal feeling to the other people that they were dancing with, but their intention and the meaning that they derived from the experience was quite different. The people in our study were in despair, were in terror, were in a crisis around death, around the fear of recurrence, the fear of dying of cancer, the fear of leaving the world. And that was the context in which they had this experience. So it's a biological intervention and it's a psychological intervention. Within psychiatry, we had this long-standing conflict between the body and the mind, psychotherapy versus medication. And I believe that psychedelic medicines and psilocybin in particular stand at the crossroads and bring both together. It would be, I think, an error to say, is this a psychological or a physiological biochemical effect? It is both, and one creates and informs the other. The psychological effect can vary depending on the intention, the set and setting that the context brings. That's why if somebody takes psilocybin and they're going to plan to go about their day-to-day business and go out on the street and shop for groceries, they're going to have a disorganized, trivial, and perhaps even terrifying experience. So it's a terrible way to use the medicine, and it's not going to be a helpful experience for them. But if they take it, the very same chemical in a controlled, carefully structured setting, it can be profoundly transformative. Now, you're probably not going to find anybody who's prescribing Zoloft or Prozac that says, well, for this medicine to work, you need to do it in this way, you need to, change your life in this way or that way. The medicine goes in, it does what it's going to do. It's purely a mechanical, biochemically based model for understanding the action.
And Dr. Gus, what feedback have you gotten from your colleagues about the study?
My colleagues are excited, interested, curious about the study. Some of them will privately share their experiences with psychedelics in the past and wish that, we had some free samples that we could distribute. We have not had from colleagues very much backlash about this being running the risk of addiction. There's a lot of evidence that psychedelics not only are not addictive, but are in some ways protective against some mental health problems, such as suicidality and recidivism in parolees from jail. But by and large, they are curious and kind of excited.
Dr. Gus, as you look into the crystal ball, what do you see for the future of psychedelic research in general and psilocybin in particular when it comes to, for example, cancer patients in distress or other health conditions? We haven't seen a lot of money available from the National Institutes of Health for this kind of research, and the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, has been kind of skeptical. Do you see that changing?
No, I don't see that changing. I suspect that psychedelic research will continue to be largely privately funded by philanthropists who are interested in advancing this area of research. I'm hoping that will change, but we certainly are not going to get funded through NIDA, the National Institute for Drug Abuse. But we are hoping that if we can provide sufficient Phase 3 data, that we may be able to get NIH funding for future studies. So to answer your first question, you are right that at this point, the only path forward for psychedelic medicines is as treatment for well-defined psychiatric conditions. And you'll notice that within cancer anxiety, existential anxiety or existential distress is not a well-recognized condition in the sense that it's a DSM-5 category. That's why we primarily focused on anxiety and depression symptoms, and the existential issues of meaning in life, fear of death, and so forth were really not our primary findings. They were not our primary research indicators, because everything that we're doing is geared towards rescheduling. As you probably know, psilocybin is a Schedule I medicine, which means that along with LSD, mescaline, heroin, PCP, and a number of other drugs that can be abused, it is categorized as Schedule I, which means that it supposedly has no medical value and is highly addictive. And it's our goal to show that it, A, has medical value, and B, is not addictive, that people can take these medicines in a controlled, careful setting safely without risk of addiction or harm coming to them as a result of it. So at the present, we are gearing up to do a Phase 3 study of cancer-related anxiety. The studies that were published in the Journal of Pharmacology in December were Phase 2 studies, which means that they were feasibility and safety studies, trying to show that this study could be done and that it could be done safely. And we succeeded on both counts. There were no serious adverse effects in either the Johns Hopkins or the NYU study, and both studies were, completed. So they showed feasibility, that you can do it, and safety, that you can do it safely. The next step is going to be a Phase 3 study. This will have 300 participants in it, so 5 or 6 times as many. This is going to be a multi-center trial located at 5 or 6 different university settings around the country. So in the future is a Phase 3 study of cancer anxiety, psilocybin-assisted therapy for cancer anxiety. Also here at NYU, but also at the Imperial College in London and at Yale University, there are projects underway to treat depression as a primary focus for psilocybin treatment. Some places it's treatment-resistant depression, which are patients who have not been helped by at least 2 traditional treatments, and others it's a more general population of depression, major depressive disorder patients, and trying to treat that with short-term therapy with a psilocybin-assisted approach. By short-term therapy, I mean 1 or 2 sessions before and 1 or 2 sessions after the psychedelic session, not so much the 9 sessions that we had. There is also at Yale a project underway to treat obsessive-compulsive disorder with psilocybin-assisted therapy. At Johns Hopkins, there is a study going on with cigarette smoking and psilocybin-assisted therapy. In addition to that, we have one non-clinical study that is going on in combination with Johns Hopkins and NYU, and that is a religious professionals study. This is a study which looks at people who are thought to be experts in the world of spirituality, describing spiritual states, and accessing spiritual states of consciousness. So we thought that it would be valuable to work with those individuals and ask them to describe their experience, and also to describe how being part of a psilocybin experience changed the way that they relate to their parishioners or their flock or their whoever it is that the religious professionals are leading, and their relationship with Scripture or holy books, and the relationship with the spiritual world or God per se. So it's a way of taking people who are experts in this world, who are psychedelic naive, giving them a psilocybin session and seeing what they have to say. So this is unusual in that this is not being given for a diagnostic condition. In order for a drug to be rescheduled from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2, where it could be legally prescribed, it has to show safety and efficacy in a particular condition, which means it has to be linked to a DSM-5 diagnosable psychiatric illness.
You're listening to Dr. Jeffrey Guss, Clinical Associate Professor of Psychiatry at New York University School of Medicine. He's a senior faculty member of the Division of Alcohol and Drug Abuse in NYU's Department of Psychiatry. Dr. Guss is also the Director of Psychedelic Psychotherapy Training for the NYU Psilocybin and Cancer Anxiety Study. You'll find a link to his publication from our website.
You know, it's so interesting that in the 50s and 60s, these kinds of drugs were being studied by a lot of academic researchers, but by the mid-70s, they were out of favor. And here it is 30, 40 years later, and they're being studied again carefully to see if they can help against depression, anxiety, and perhaps some other psychological problems.
Very cautiously, but definitely. Dr. Guss mentioned obsessive-compulsive disorder and tobacco cessation in addition to depression and anxiety.
Now, of course, there's still no federal funding, and the use of hallucinogens to help overcome any condition is not a do-it-yourself project. This is going to require medical supervision.
Definitely.
We need to take a short break. When we come back, we'll hear about a typical patient's experience.
We'll also find out if people who aren't religious are resistant to this type of therapy.
Some of the transformations Dr. Guss describes among the patients sound a bit like those described by people who have been through a near-death experience.
Are there people for whom psilocybin therapy would be inappropriate?
Some people worry about entering a state of altered consciousness. What should they know about psilocybin?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. If you value the health information you get when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, consider subscribing to our email newsletter. You'll get the latest health news and information on upcoming podcasts delivered to your inbox twice a week. Look for the link at peoplespharmacy.com. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Red X Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Foot Cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel utterly soft and smooth. The number is 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
To purchase a CD of today's show or any People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1084. That number again, 800-732-2334. You can also find it at peoplespharmacy.com. You can also download the free podcast from iTunes or from our web store, and we invite you to consider writing a review.
Today, we're discussing the potential uses of psilocybin to ease cancer-related anxiety and depression. Many health professionals have written off hallucinogens as irrelevant to modern medicine. The FDA considers psilocybin a Class 1 drug, meaning that it has no medicinal benefit and is dangerous. But not all medical scientists agree. In the last few years, there's been some interesting research published in peer-reviewed journals.
Our guest is Dr. Jeffrey Guss, Clinical Associate Professor of Psychiatry at New York University School of Medicine. He's a senior faculty member of the Division of Alcohol and Drug Abuse in NYU's Department of Psychiatry. Dr. Guss is the Director of Psychedelic Psychotherapy Training for the NYU Psilocybin and Cancer Anxiety Study.
Dr. Guss, you mentioned subjects, and I wonder if you could share with our listeners a typical subject in this study and how it may have affected them. And I'm also curious, in addition, you talk about spiritual awakening and transformation. What about people who were atheists or not religious? Did it have a potentially positive effect on them as well?
Quite remarkably. I'm going to answer the second question first. There is somebody who was in the study, not my patient, but Tony's, who has spoken about this, and I think it's actually been quoted in the newspaper about this. Somebody who is a devout, card-carrying, lifelong atheist who nonetheless had a pretty severe experience of existential anxiety, hopelessness, despair, withdrawal from the world, anger and irritability, and just a sense of bitterness. She had, during her psychedelic journey, under the guidance of her therapists, what she experienced as being bathed in God's love, being bathed in the light of sort of some kind of divine love and protection and warmth. And this was a direct experience that she had. And afterwards she said, I'm still an atheist, but there's no other words that I can use to describe what it felt like to me to have this experience. So she still saw it as an effect of her own brain and mind and the medicine in her mind, but that the language that she used, the only language that she found that was truly meaningful for her, was that she was bathed in God's love and in the light of spiritual awakening for her. And this brought about a number of changes in the way that she led her life: a decrease in irritability, an increase in energy, an increase in connecting with family. She also started exercising, and she joined a Caribbean dance class at her local Y and became friends with the ladies in that and did that 3 times a week. I mean, that's a good example of integration where not only did she think, I'm going to get up and get out and start living again, but she actually did it. And, of course, so many benefits come from aerobic exercise like that. And yet it was the psilocybin experience that I think awoke this sense of energy and I can and I will and I am making these changes.
Dr. Guss, you mentioned that you also had a subject, a participant in this study, who had a transformative experience. I wonder if you could describe that, please.
Sure. This is a woman who was in her 70s, who was a volunteer working in adult literacy, helping adults that couldn't read learn to read for the first time in their lives. And she was married, and she had a troubled relationship with her daughter and grandchild, and had essentially collapsed in all ways. She had stopped trying to be a grandmother. She had stopped caring about being a mother. She had stopped her volunteer work. And she was apathetic about pursuing any of her chemotherapy treatments. She even described in a kind of paradigmatic scene, sitting in her bedroom, watching her digital clock flip from 1 minute to the next, not doing anything, just staring at time passing, quite literally staring at the moments in her life pass away. Because this woman was heavy, she received quite a large dose of psilocybin. I don't think we spoke about this, but the people in our study received their dosage based on their weight. They received 0.3 milligrams per kilogram. So since she was heavy, she received the largest dose, in fact, of anybody in our study, and had quite a profound disorganization in her during her experience, meaning she wasn't really fully able to talk. She looked quite agitated, and we were quite worried that she was having a horrible experience. But to our amazement, as she came out of it, having looked so distressed and so out of it, she described a beautiful experience, one that was, even for her, without words, of communing with nature and with God, and a rebirth of love for herself, for her husband, for her daughter, and for her grandchild. She also felt a sense of caring about the planet and environmental issues that she had never had before. And this sense of caring about something outside yourself is a theme that we hear again and again from people. Caring about having compassion for yourself, compassion for others, and compassion for the planet, where we're all trying to live and survive. Another fascinating thing that happened is that when her husband arrived at the end of the day, they had a very lovely reunion, and in order to prepare people to leave, we have them stand up and walk down the hall 50 feet and then come back to make certain that they're confident and steady on their feet. And he noticed that a limp that she'd had and a kind of problem with her gait was remarkably gone, and that a facial frown and a kind of saggingness in her face was transformed, and that she looked more alive and walked differently and spoke differently. And this transition occurred, as a direct result of this, what appeared to be a very, very arduous struggle through her journey. This taught us so much about trusting that a difficult journey is not a bad journey. It's a challenging one. When you look at the Old Testament and you see people who are having a visitation with God, who are speaking with God, who are feeling the presence of God, again and again they are falling on the ground trembling. It is not, it doesn't happen in the Old Testament that you see God and have a nice time and chat and feel comfortable. So this apprehension of the divine, of this profound state of consciousness, often is a combination of exhilaration and excitation with a certain amount of fear. And it's fear of the unknown, fear of the profoundness of the experience, fear of the loss of the narrative, autobiographical self. And this, profound experience is what leaves such a deep mark, such a deep impression on people. Sometimes people will ask, well, how is it that one experience can be so profound? But, when somebody is in a terrible traumatic experience in life, if they're raped or if they see a murder or are a witness to a catastrophe, that one experience can impact them for years. So we don't have any trouble conceiving that a single dreadful, terrible experience could influence somebody for years to come. But it is true that in some circumstances, a single profound, transformative, positive experience can bring about changes that are quite long-lasting.
Did you follow up with this woman, and did you find out how she fared with her daughter and her grandchild?
Yes, I've been in contact with her every couple of months since being in the study, and also as a result of the paper being published, she was interviewed again, and these changes have sustained themselves for her. She continues to work in her adult literacy volunteer work and continues being close with her husband, daughter, and grandchild. And most importantly, feeling a sense of profound love for herself, for the world around her, and a decreased fear of cancer and a decreased preoccupation with just dying and getting it all over with. So it really restored her will to live and her wish to live.
Dr. Gus, a lot of what you're describing in terms of the long-lasting impact of the psilocybin treatment program is a little like the near-death experience. We've heard repeatedly that when people go through a near-death experience, they come back changed, with many of the same descriptions that you've used, a whole new appreciation for life, for themselves, for those around them, and a loss of fear of death. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I believe that so much of what governs us in our day-to-day life has at its core a denial of the reality of death. We think the same thoughts, we follow the same patterns, whether they're thought patterns or behavioral patterns or emotional patterns, and these all give a sense of sameness, predictability, and timelessness, so we can do this forever, that I have all the time left in the world. And the near-death experience, and for many people, a psychedelic experience, is a very blunt reminder that our time here is limited, and that the only way to meaningfully grapple with that fact is to live absolutely, fully, deeply, and honestly in the present. The only way to respond to the reality of death is to live fully in the present, because the deep acceptance of the fact that we are all mortal offers us no choice other than awakening into the present moment, which is, of course, all we have.
There are a lot of listeners who are fearful, not just of death, but also of altered consciousness. And so the very idea of taking a psychedelic drug like psilocybin scares them. And I suspect that there are a lot of health professionals who are a little afraid of the idea of this sort of loss of control. What would you like them to know from your research?
Well, I would like to reassure them that their fear is very understandable and I think is of value. These are powerful medicines, not to be taken lightly and not to be taken casually. So the fear reflects the profundity with which they can have an effect. I also would like to suggest to some people that are afraid of psychedelics that they may not be the right path for them, and that the way into a spiritual awakening, there are many ways: meditation, exercise, rhythmic trance induction, fasting, prayer. All of these are paths into spiritual awakenings that are more gradual paths. The psychedelic path is a steep path. It's an intense path. And I think that it is more suited to people who have a greater tolerance for novelty and who have less fear of loss of control. For a person who has a tremendous fear of loss of control, starting with psilocybin may be too intense of an entry point. If they wanted to work with medicine, they may do better with MDMA, which has less anxiety and more predictable, lovely, good, warm feeling attached to it.
What is MDMA, Dr. Gus?
Well, MDMA is the same compound as ecstasy. So this is not a psychedelic per se. It's what's called an empathogen, meaning that instead of awakening the God within, which is what an entheogen does, it awakens caring, warmth, and sense of interpersonal connectedness. So it does not have the divine component of awakening to the higher power as much as it does the awakening to the love within, both for yourself and for others around you. And a decrease in fear, a decrease in guardedness, a decrease in paranoia, and a decrease in sense of that the world is a fearful place. Instead, it becomes a place worthy of trust and deserving of love. And so this is I think, an easier path for somebody who has a fear of loss of control. But for somebody who their fear of loss of control or fear of the unknown is so great, I would say, proceed cautiously. Only proceed into settings in which you're very certain of the quality of the therapists that you're working with, the quality of the materials that you're working with, and start low and go slow if somebody's really drawn to this path. We, in our study, tried to give a moderately high dose because it was our goal to bring our subjects into the mystical, or the realm of the mystical experience. And that requires a relatively high dose. And there's a direct relationship between the experience of anxiety and panic and the entry into the mystical state. The mystical state is an exhilarated state that can have anxiety and whatever you want to call the anxiety with a positive valence, exhilaration, awe. I think awe would probably be the best word to describe anxiety with a positive valence. It's a state of great arousal, but instead of fear that you have in anxiety, with awe you have love, safety, and a sense of a benevolent, divine, presence. instead of a malevolent, frightening, destructive one, which is what you have with anxiety.
Dr. Jeffrey Guss, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
You're most welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
You've been listening to Dr. Jeffrey Guss, Clinical Associate Professor of Psychiatry at New York University School of Medicine. He's a senior faculty member of the Division of Alcohol and Drug Abuse in NYU's Department of Psychiatry. Dr. Guss is the Director of Psychedelic Psychotherapy Training for the NYU Psilocybin and Cancer Anxiety Study. You'll find a link to his study and other research at our website, peoplespharmacy.com.
And a reminder, this is not, emphasize not, a do-it-yourself project. This requires very skilled psychotherapists as well as a lot of support that cannot be achieved on your own.
Dr. Guss made it clear that the therapeutic setting is really critical, and it also allows people then to integrate the experience into how they live their lives going forward.
The FDA does consider psilocybin a Schedule I controlled substance, meaning there is no currently accepted medical use in the United States and a high potential for abuse. Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for listening. Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Russ Henry is the engineer. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible by Red X Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Extra Care 20 Cream with 20% urea for extra skin protection. 800-345-7339. Online at uttercream.com.
To buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1084. That number again, 800-732-2334. Online at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit our site, you can check out information on prescription drugs, herbal medicines, and home remedies. Share your thoughts on today's show. We'd love to have your feedback.
At our website, you can also sign up for our free online newsletter or the free podcast of the show. You can listen at your own convenience or share it with a friend. We'd certainly appreciate you rating us on iTunes or Google Play or wherever you might subscribe. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.